Good morning. Good to be here with you. If you will, open up to Daniel chapter 3. And we're going to be taking a look there in Daniel chapter 3. One of the many different series that we're doing this year, whether or not you realize it, is a series of looking at Old Testament stories and then applying them to ourselves today. And this is part of that series, of course, and part of the reason for that is to look at some more interesting stories of the Old Testament, but also part of the reason is to look at some of the stories that we probably know best from the Old Testament, because we may not have really examined them in depth since we were in Bible school ourselves, perhaps. But this morning we're going to take a look at a well-known story. We're going to try to apply it in ways that maybe we've not thought of before, and we're going to try to understand it a little bit better as well. And of course, part of doing that, we'll be looking at the context of the book of Daniel, and we'll actually start back in chapter 1 if you want to turn there first. But let's also say that as we begin, obedience is a good thing. Obedience is a virtue, and obedience is certainly a good thing for children as well. I've used this quote before, but from Benjamin Franklin, he says, "Let a child's first lesson be obedience, and his second lesson be what thou wilt." As in, if you can teach a child to be obedient, then after that they can learn to do anything, because they have that foundation established. And today, obedience is kind of taboo almost, because we don't want people to be submissive. But of course, with children are happier when they are obedient, and with us and God, we are happier when we are obedient to Him, even though that doesn't always happen. But with obedience, the other side of it, of course, is disobedience. And rarely, disobedience can be as much of a virtue as obedience can. Except that, when we're talking about disobedience, and specifically in this story and many other times in the Bible, when somebody is disobedient, they're disobedient to man. And disobedience to man can often be obedience to God. And so we're going to look at all those themes as we look at the book of Daniel. Like I said, let's start in chapter 1, verse 3. Chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "The king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans." Well, that's a good place to start, except that there's a lot of things that we might not be familiar with if we've not looked at Daniel for quite some time. So, first thing we want to talk about is the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans are also known, or probably better known outside of the Bible, as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There's a real old Babylonian Empire. This one came a little bit later in the same territory with the same capital city and had those similarities. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire, to this point in world history, is the largest, as in most expansive, the most powerful, and the wealthiest nation to ever exist up to this point in history. There would be ones that would come along later that would be more powerful and more wealthy, but as far as we've gotten in history so far, they are the most powerful. And in history, we're about at 600 BC. It's estimated that this account takes place around 605 BC. So again, that's 605 years before Christ. And that also puts us, historically speaking, for the Jews, in the exilic period. So the period in which the Jews were in exile. Now, the northern tribes have already been in exile for a long time in Assyria, but then we have the two southern tribes that are just called Judah as far as the nation goes, who have also been carried off into Babylonian exile, at least part of them. This is more specifically within the exile, the period of the first deportation. So it's the first group that is sent from Israel, or from Judah rather, all the way over to Babylon. But that'll happen a couple more times, and it will culminate in the destruction of Jerusalem entirely in 586 BC. So we're at 605, but it'll be a little while until everything else takes place, and that would be more the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. But for now, we have Daniel. And in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 that we just read, we saw that the king wanted to bring certain people from the land of Judah to Babylon. Why? Well, because he wants the best and brightest among the Jews in his service. And so he's going to find some of them, which means that the four people that we know from this book, the Jews, Daniel, and then Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, all four of them are, according to the description, young, without blemish, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand. Well, that's pretty high praise. Of course, it sounds kind of self-glorifying from Daniel since he's writing the book, but still, it is the desire of the king to have these men, and the men that we are going to encounter are some of them. Now, Daniel, ironically for us, is not really going to be a major part of our story, but he is the one that's writing about this, and he's the one that's going to have them actually end up being in a pretty important position. Daniel himself, along with his three friends. Skip to the end of chapter 2. We're going to look at verse 48. Daniel 2:48. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Verse 49, also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gates or the court of the king. So Daniel, if you remember in the story, if you look through chapter 2, you'll see that he interprets the dreams of the king. It's kind of interesting the parallel that this story has with other stories in the Bible, like the story of Joseph. Daniel rises to prominence much in the same way that Joseph does. But he is promoted to a very high position. He is over the province of Babylon, meaning the area around the capital of Babylon, not one of these outer provinces where you might throw somebody else that you think should be in power, but you don't necessarily like him that much. Apparently the king is very fond of Daniel, and so he gets this prominent position. And he sits in the court of the king, which means he would have his meals with the king. He would be one of the most important people in all the land. And Daniel also gets, through his now important position, he gets his friends promoted as well. And they're promoted to a lesser position, but they're still pretty important. But of course, all that's going to change very soon. And it's going to change because there's some people that seem to be jealous of foreigners being in power. And that, of course, parallels pretty well with the story of Esther as well. Even Nehemiah to a certain extent. There are people that don't want the Jews to be able to rebuild. So in chapter 3 now, in verse 4, we have this announcement made. It says, chapter 3, verse 4, Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, that you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Well, if you know the story, you know some people are about to end up in that fiery furnace. And you can imagine why they end up there, because they do the exact opposite of this command. So Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, of course, being good Jews and being good, faithful people to God, say, actually, we're not going to bow to anyone except God. And that doesn't really work out for them too well. But the command is repeated down in verse 15, and the question is asked at the end of verse 15, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Great question. Of course, that question will soon be answered. But then verse 16, the response, a wonderful response is given by these three men. And the response that they give says, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Oh, you don't. So they go to the king, and the king has said, you did something wrong. And they say, yeah, we don't really owe you an answer. That sounds very stubborn to us. It sounds, I don't even know what it sounds. It sounds arrogant for us. And yeah, they're doing it not out of any kind of arrogance, but out of humility. And that's why when we start talking about obedience and disobedience, it depends on where those things are rooted from. They're disobedient to man to the point that it seems arrogant to the king, and he's going to be very angry, as we'll see. But from a spiritual perspective, why are they doing this? It's not that they want to be disobedient to man, but they will not be disobedient to God. And in humility, they will be obedient no matter what that requires. Verse 17. If that is the case, as in if you're going to put us to death, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Now, I think we probably understand that part. We might remember that part from the story when we were younger. But we might not remember verse 18. Where in verse 18 they say, but if not. If not what? If our God, who is able to deliver us, if he doesn't do that, verse 18, then let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They say, first off, our first answer is, well, we don't really feel like we have to answer that question because it's between us and God. But beyond that, we want you to know that our God is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we would still never worship you. That's the faith that they have before they ever go into the furnace. I know we remember them as people of faith, I hope, these three, but at the same time, their faith was willing to go to the point of death, just like with Christ. He was obedient to the point of death. And they say the same thing. Okay, sure, if that's what's required, then that's what will happen. Well, as you can imagine, the king loves to have people disagree with him. The king loves to have people argue with him. And the king says, that's good. You guys go on with your day and we'll settle this some other time. Except instead in verse 19 it says Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury and the expression on his face changed. You think it did? I don't know exactly what his face looked like, but it was not pleasant, I'm sure. Because he's having three people who are kind of important in his kingdom anyway defy him as openly as possible. And so his face changes towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Verse 21, then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, and their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. One comment on the clothing there. Turbans were worn at this time in the area of Babylon, not so much by the Jews, but they were dressing in the culture that they lived in. Just as a note there, but the furnace is being heated up 7 times hotter, I guess to reflect how angry Nebuchadnezzar is at what's going on. But how hot is that? Well, I don't really know exactly. It depends on how hot the furnace usually is. But if it's anything like any modern furnace, you're probably talking about a few hundred degrees at least. So if you're going to heat this up to 7 times the normal, you're probably looking at 2,000 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know how that sounds to you, but that sounds kind of uncomfortable to me. And they should have died immediately as they were thrown into the fire. Of course, we'll see in verse 22 that the fire actually kills the mighty men of valor that throw them into that fire. And yet they don't die. I don't know how that's possible, except if there's a miracle happening, which of course there is. Now beyond that, they are bound. It doesn't say what they're bound with. When I first read it, I kind of thought they were bound with rope, but there's no reason to think that, because more likely they were bound with chains. And of course that should allow them to be completely killed with no trouble. They're bound and you threw them into a fire. Most people would expect for them to die. And yet, we keep reading the story. Verse 24, which was read for us a few minutes ago. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose in haste, and he says to his counselors, do we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. Yeah, it's true. Verse 25, but look, he answered, I see 4 men, and they're loose in the fire, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Something strange is happening. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar realizes that immediately. But Nebuchadnezzar is astonished for good reason. Because there's a miracle happening here, although there's actually 2 miracles that are happening here. We don't usually think about the other one, but they were bound in chains. In the New Testament, when we see Peter in prison and his chains are loose, we think, oh, wow, a miracle. But we forget about it this time. But there's actually a twofold miracle then. Because they were in chains and they've been freed, and they're still alive. Which is impossible. They cannot be alive in that kind of heat, and yet there they are, walking around in the flames. I kind of wonder if they carried the chains out with them, just because. I don't know if they left them in there or not, or maybe someone forgot their hat in there, so they went back in just to get it. I don't really know what the situation was, but it was impressive. It was pretty incredible if you had been there for it. And of course, it gets more impressive because the details are given. And God doesn't have to give these details, but they're fascinating. So verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar, fun fact, in the middle of Nebuchadnezzar's name is the name Chad, so I think that's probably what he went by for short. But Chad, or Nebuchadnezzar, went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. His tone has changed just a little bit from verse 15 where he says, and who is this God that will deliver you out of my hands? Well, apparently it's their God. It's that one. It's the Most High God that he now recognizes. He says, in that God's name, come out and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the midst of the fire, verse 27. And the satraps, the administrators, the governors, those are all just three different names for officials within the kingdom. So it's not just that the king saw this, but everybody in his court saw it. It says that they saw these men on whose body the fire had no power, and the hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. I'm impressed. Now I know this is a miracle of God, and God can do anything. God created the universe, so for him, this is really no big deal. But it's just not possible in human terms. But for God, the impossible is very possible. Their bodies, not burned. Their clothes, not burned. Their hair, not burned. And they don't even smell like smoke. I don't know about you, but anytime that I'm within 100 feet of a fire, I smell like smoke for the rest of the day. I don't know how it happens, but every time. They were in the fire, and nothing. They don't even smell like the smoke that they were in. So it's a pretty impressive miracle that takes place. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar, for him, at least to some extent, he's going to believe that this God is at least a powerful God, if not the God of the whole universe. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's words, and yielded their bodies, again, sacrificed themselves, that they should not serve nor worship any God except their own God. They do all this just because they would not worship anyone else. They were disobedient to man so that they could be obedient to God. That's the whole point of this story. But Nebuchadnezzar is impressed by their God, but he seems just as impressed by the three of them, because they had enough faith to act out what they believed about their God. Verse 29, Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you blaspheme that God, you will be cut up in pieces, and your house will be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Remember back to verse 15? What God will deliver them from my hand? And that's this God. And he was able to deliver. Verse 30, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So they were promoted probably not just to their former rank, but even more than they were before. So they actually end up better off through the whole affair than when they started. But the statements that Nebuchadnezzar makes of his own sort of belief are impressive, but then that he makes a law against blaspheming that God, a God that's not his own God, it's not a Babylonian, it's not a Chaldean God, that's pretty impressive as well. That he would be willing to punish those who blaspheme a foreign God. But that shows exactly how much faith was instilled in Nebuchadnezzar at the time of seeing this, which it should have been. But what do we do with this whole story? There's a lot more to Daniel, but this is the story that we're looking at this morning. Just the fiery furnace and the saving of these three men in the fiery furnace. What do we learn from that? Well, first let's ask a question that I'll give a very brief answer to, but I think it has to be the answer, and it deserves a lesson by itself, and it'll get a lesson by itself sometime. The question is, who else was in the furnace with them? If there were three men in the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar saw four men in the furnace, then who was the fourth one? Well, that is a good question. We don't have full time to answer that, but what we know is, verse 25, at the end of it, the fourth is like the Son of God, or it can also be translated like a son of the gods. It's possible. But then we also see in verse 28 that Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, "Blessed be the God of you three who sent his angel." So we have two descriptions here of who this might be. Well, at the very least, this is an angel that God specifically sent. Not just any angel even, but probably a specific angel. Maybe Michael, maybe Gabriel. But more than that is probably most likely that it is the Son of God before his time on earth. Now, like I said, it requires a full lesson to actually get into that. But if the Spirit didn't mean to imply Jesus, then the Spirit got a little confused when writing this. So it seems odd that the Spirit would hint this heavily toward the Son of God, if that's not what's meant. But we'll address that in another lesson sometime. But let's make some more application. This application is always fun because it still applies to us today. Because we're talking about an event that happened 2,600 years ago. And yet, it still applies today, and it's applied all throughout history. So what's the application? Society will always be shocked when you don't do the same thing that they do. And sometimes society will be militant when you don't do the same things that they do. When society says, in this case, to bow to a statue, and if you don't bow to a statue, you can be punished with death, that's pretty harsh. I know it's a command from the king as well, but again, society will always be shocked. They'll always be amazed when you don't do exactly what they think you should do. And yet sometimes it's necessary. In the case here, or in any case where the choice is between God and man, the choice is God. Another point that is kind of central to this whole story is that God is with people in trials. And then there's a but that comes after that. God is with people in trials, but he doesn't always prevent those trials from happening. Would we remember this story if they had not bowed to the statue and they went before the king and they said, well, we're not going to follow, and the king said, yeah, okay, I think that makes sense. I believe in God. We might remember it kind of, but we remember it because they went through the trial and they came out on the other side. But they went through that trial. God didn't prevent it from happening. Of course, the same thing also happens in Daniel with Daniel in the lion's den. Did God prevent him from being thrown in? No. He just helped him through the trial that he was in. Same thing can be said of Christ. If Christ had called 10,000 angels, would we remember his story? Yeah. But is it the same as him dying alone for you and me? Sometimes the trial is part of the story that's necessary. And I'm not trying to say that we go through every bad thing for some good reason. Some bad things happen because they just happen. But sometimes God is able to use those things. I know this is probably true for most of us, that we've seen this kind of tragedy take place. But God can use tragedy. But I've seen people that have been sick to the point of death, and I get to see the power of God when prayer is answered and they're healed. And I've seen people that are sick to the point of death where in spite of prayer, they die anyway, and I still get to see the power of God in the way that they handled that situation. I'm not saying that one of those is better, that one of those is right, but God can use tragedy, and God can use trial. And he did in this case. He does in a lot of cases. But God is with us even in the midst of that trial. Of course, that holds all the more true if that is the Son of God standing in the flames with them. Another point worth making from verse 29 at the end of the verse, we already read it, but it says, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Is there any other God that can do that? Now, certainly not the gods of the Chaldeans, or not the gods of the ancient Greeks, or not of the gods of any modern religion. But is there any other God, anything that we turn to that can deliver us? And the answer is no, not in this life and not beyond this life either, but a lot of people turn to their own gods. They'll turn to money, they'll turn to fame, or to knowledge, or to power, or to possessions, but can those things save us? What of those gods is going to deliver us from trials in this life? What of those idols is going to deliver us when this life is over? There is no other God that can deliver like this. Defiance of authority, when it is warranted, that is, it may require some bravery on the part of man. It may appear to be stubborn, or it may appear to be arrogant, but it depends on where that disobedience, where that defiance comes from. And again, like we've said, disobedience to men, at least when we are backed up by the Bible, can be obedience to God. I think if they had just been willing to say, yeah, we're just going to be disobedient to the king, we'll see how this plays out, we just don't really want to do it. But instead they say, well, we're not going to do this because we have a reason, because God told us not to do this, then it changes their own situation, their own understanding, because it's not, well, I want to disobey the king just for fun. It's, I'm going to disobey the king not because I want to, but because God tells me to, and I want to be humbly obedient to him. If we are disobedient out of a spirit of humility and submission to God, then that makes that decision a lot easier. I know a lot of times that seems difficult for us to defy some earthly thing that's going on, but if our motivation is from God and being obedient to him, then that changes. But with that, this morning, that's the end of our study. That's the end of our application of our study. And so the question is, who will we be obedient to? That's an individual question. It's a question that each one of us has to answer. If you don't answer it, you've already made your choice. But this morning, are you going to be obedient to God? A very specific way that we do that. Normally it's on the screen behind me, but we didn't do that this morning. But the obedience to God requires that we hear his word, which we do each Sunday that we're here. It requires that we believe in him, at least to the extent that Nebuchadnezzar did, but even more to the extent that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. It requires us to repent of the things that we have done evil in our lives. It requires us to confess Jesus as the Son of God. And it requires us to be baptized and to live faithfully to God, in obedience to God. This morning, if that's what you need, this morning if you're struggling with the pressure of the world, this morning if you're going through trial, or this morning if you have any tie to this story or any other need that has arisen in your life, and this is the time to address it. If there's anything that we can do as the church to help you, as you come forward now, as we stand, as we sing.